Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 523, and it is titled Life of Benjamin Franklin, and it is written by John W. Gunn. And this is part 3. We left off at the top of page 26, and that's where we'll pick up. Passage under the notion of my being a young acquaintance of his that had got a naughty girl with child, whose friends would compel me to marry her, and therefore I could not appear or come away publicly. With money obtained from the sale of his book, Benjamin embarked on his first adventure in the world. And I know I read that that's the end of the last. There was but one printing shop in New York, and it offered no employment. But the printer, William Bradford, said his son, who was a printer in Philadelphia, had lost his chief helper by death, and might give the boy a job. So to Philadelphia Franklin went, and of his journey, which was accompanied by some vicissitudes, he gives a highly entertaining account in his autobiography. An account which is vividly descriptive of the conditions of travel in those colonial days. The story of Franklin's first appearance in Philadelphia, walking up the street with a roll under each arm and manfully masticating a third roll, passing before the amused eyes of his future wife, Deborah Reed, is a commonplace of popular history. Bradford did not need a printer, but Franklin found employment with the other printer, Samuel Keimer. This man's character is comically described by Franklin in the autobiography. He loved argument, had a streak of the religious charlatan in him, professing no particular religion, but something of all on occasion, composed verse indifferently at the type-case, and was usually a great glutton. Franklin used the insidiously leading method of Socrates in arguing with Keimer until the latter grew ridiculously cautious, and would hardly answer me the most common question without asking first, "What do you intend to infer from that?" However, it gives him so high an opinion of my abilities in the confuting way, that he seriously proposed my being his colleague in a project he had of setting up a new sect. A propos of Keimer's gluttony, there is a story that is too good to pass by. Franklin, through the chance reading of a book on vegetarianism, had been converted to this system of diet. He had reverted at the time to carnivorous habits, but he now got Keimer to try the vegetable diet with him, and this is how it came out. Keimer wore his beard at full length, because somewhere in the Mosaic law it is said, "Thou shalt not mar the corners of thy beard." He likewise kept the seventh-day Sabbath, and these 2 points were essentials for him. I disliked both, but agreed to admit them upon condition of his adopting the doctrine of using no animal food. "I doubt," he said, "my constitution would not bear that." I assured him it would, and that he would be the better for it. He was usually a great glutton, and I promised myself some diversion in half-starving him. He agreed to try the practice, if I would keep him company. I did so, and we held it for 3 months. We had our victuals dressed and brought to us regularly by a woman in the neighborhood, who had from me a list of 40 dishes to be prepared for us at different times, in all which there was neither fish, flesh, nor fowl, and the whim suited me the better at the time from the cheapness of it, not costing us above 18 pence sterling each per week. I went on pleasantly, but poor Keimer suffered grievously. Tired of the project, longed for the flesh pots of Egypt, and ordered a roast pig. He invited me and 2 women friends to dine with him, but it being brought too soon upon table, he could not resist the temptation, and ate the whole before we came. It is evident that Franklin's chief object in his pact with Keimer was one of practical fun, rather than of dietetic propaganda. He, however, always clung in principle to vegetarianism and to moderate living in all things. This is not to say that he was not ascetic. Far from it. He often departed from his rules of health, and in his last years was a periodical victim of the gout, an experience which he relates in a humorous sketch, Dialogue between Franklin and the Gout. Contrary to the custom of the day, Franklin believed in the free use of water, both internally and externally. He drank copiously of cold water to cure a fever, a treatment which was generally regarded as harmful by his contemporaries. He was also a pioneer in the matter of bathing, and for a skin ailment, I took a hot bath twice a week, 2 hours at a time. This affliction reoccurred when he confesses he hardly bathed in those 3 months. He was an excellent swimmer, another unusual accomplishment. He had advanced views about fresh air, concerning which John Adams gives an entertaining sketch in his autobiography. Adams and Franklin were traveling together in 1776, and says the former, at Brunswick, but one bed could be procured for Dr. Franklin and me, in a chamber little larger than the bed, without a chimney, and with only one small window. The window was open, and I, who was an invalid and afraid of the air of night, shut it close. "Oh," says Franklin, "don't shut the window. We shall be suffocated." I answered I was afraid of the evening air. Dr. Franklin replied, "The air within this chamber will soon be, and indeed is now, worse than that without doors. Come, open the window, and come to bed, and I will convince you. I believe you are not acquainted with my theory of colds." Opening the window and leaping into bed, I said I had read his letters to Dr. Cooper, in which he had advanced that nobody ever got cold by going into a cold church or any other cold air. But the theory was so little consistent with my experience that I thought it a paradox. However, I had so much curiosity to hear his reasons that I would run the risk of a cold. The doctor then began to harangue upon air and cold, and respiration and perspiration, with which I was so much amused that I soon fell asleep, and left him and his philosophy together. But I believe they were equally sound and insensible within a few minutes after me, for the last words I heard were pronounced as if he were more than half asleep. Remember little of the lecture, except that the human body, by respiration and perspiration, destroys a gallon of air in a minute. That 2 such persons as were now in that chamber would, the printing is fading, would consume all the air in it in an hour or 2. That by breathing over again and matter thrown out by the lungs and the skin, we should imbibe the real cause of colds, not from abroad, but from within. It has been mentioned that Governor Keith proposed to set Franklin up in the printing business, a proposal which Josiah Franklin skeptically refused to assist. This surprising mark of attention came to Franklin while he was working for Keimer. The governor, with another gentleman, called at the printing shop, Keimer naturally assuming that he was the one whom they wished to see. When the governor inquired instead for Franklin, Keimer stared like a pig poisoned. The young printer was taken to the tavern with these 2 distinguished gentlemen, and the governor plied him with fine compliments, holding before him the business project aforementioned. When Franklin returned from Boston with his father's unfavorable word about the business, Sir William offered to finance the young man himself, and asked Franklin to present an inventory of the equipment he should require. Then his obliging patron suggested that Franklin go to London and select personally the equipment. He was to be given a letter of credit and a number of letters to friends of Sir William. The letters were never forthcoming, although Franklin repeatedly kept appointments to call for them, but the various pretexts of the dilatory governor, though annoying, raised no real suspicion in his protege, who finally embarked for London, being assured that the letters would be placed in the care of the captain. Landing in London on Christmas Eve of 1724, Franklin quickly discovered that all the governor's splendid promises had been hollow. He learned that Sir William was well known as a man of many promises and few performances, a man who liked to flatter and please people, and who took this curious and extreme way of showing his abandoning good nature. He was left to his own devices in a strange city, in a strange country. At any rate, he had a trade. He obtained work at Palmer's printing house in Bartholomew Close, where he was employed for nearly a year. Here it was that he composed his wicked tract on religion. From here he went to the printing house of Watts, a still better one, near Lincoln's Inn Fields. Yeah. And at the latter place he fell into a somewhat amusing dispute with his fellow printers. Feeling the need of exercise, he had worked in the press room a part of the time, but being an exceedingly skilled typesetter, he was at length given work steadily in the composing room. It was customary for the workmen to keep a common sum for buying drink, and to this fund Franklin had already contributed his portion of the press room. But now the composing room chapel demanded a similar contribution, and Franklin refused it. But he reflected and saw a new light. He tells the tale. I had so many little pieces of private mischief done me, by mixing my sorts, transposing my pages, breaking my matter, etc., etc. If I were ever so little out of the room, and all ascribed to the chapel ghost, which they said ever haunted those not regularly admitted, that notwithstanding the master's protection, I found myself obliged to comply and pay the money, being convinced of the folly of being on ill terms with those one is to live with continually. He stayed 18 months in London, and the experience has been a very good thing for him, as he returned to Philadelphia a first-class printer. It was not, however, with a view to working at his trade that he returned to Philadelphia, as he had been offered a good position with a merchant, Mr. Denham, who was in London purchasing a stock of goods. The two returned together, and Franklin considered himself as definitely taking up a new career. But Denham shortly died, and there being no other commercial clerkship in sight, Franklin accepted a job again with Keimer, this time as manager of the shop. Pardon me. He found that Keimer had a number of raw hands whom Franklin was expected to teach the trade. It was the familiar case of working himself out of a job, as Franklin foresaw that when these hands became proficient, he would be discharged. However, the salary was good, and Franklin accepted the situation philosophically. At length a trifle snapped our connections, for a great noise happening near the courthouse. I put my head out of the window to see what was the matter. Keimer, being in the street, looked up and saw me, called out to me in a loud and angry tone to mind my business, adding some reproachful words that netted me the more for their publicity. All the neighbors, who were looking got on the same occasion, being witnesses how I was treated. He came up immediately into the printing house, continued the quarrel, high words passed on both sides. He gave me the quarter's warning we had stipulated, expressing the wish that he had not been obliged to so long a warning. I told him his wish was unnecessary, for I would leave him that instant, and so, taking my hat, walked out the door. Huh. That same evening, Hugh Meredith, one of his fellow employees, came to his lodgings and proposed that they go into business for themselves. He pointed out that Keimer, a very bad businessman, whose business was already in a very bad way, was sure to fail, and when Franklin objected because of his lack of money, Meredith suggested that Meredith's father, would supply the capital. It was agreed, and material was ordered from London. Meanwhile, Franklin was again employed for a while with Keimer, who faced a difficulty because of the New Jersey order for paper money, which demanded a skill he did not possess. The work was done in Burlington, then capital of the colony, and here Franklin made a number of sound acquaintances among the Jersey officials. Upon returning to Philadelphia, Franklin found that the equipment for the new printing shop had arrived, so he and Meredith at once set themselves up. We had scarce opened our letters and put our press in order, said Franklin, before George House, an acquaintance of mine, brought a countryman to see us, whom he had met in the street inquiring for a printer. The purchase of material had exhausted their capital, so the 5 shillings this job brought to provide a welcome. So the 5 shillings this job brought in proved a welcome sum. An anecdote that Franklin tells in connection with his beginning in business is so full of humor and so eternally typical that I am tempted irresistibly to quote. There are croakers in every country, always boding its ruin. Such a one then lived in Philadelphia, a person of note, an elderly man with a wise look and very grave manner of speaking. His name was Samuel Mickey. This gentleman, a stranger to me, stopped one day at my door and asked me if I was the young man who had lately opened a new printing house. Being answered in the affirmative, he said he was sorry for me, because it was an expensive undertaking and any expense would be lost, for Philadelphia was a sinking place, and people were already half bankrupt or near being so, all appearances to the contrary, such as new buildings and the rise of rents being, to his certain knowledge, fallacious, for they were in fact among the things that would soon ruin us. And he gave me such a detail of misfortunes now existing, or that were soon to exist, that he left me half melancholy. Had I known him before I engaged in this business, probably I never should have done it. This man continued to live in this decaying place and to declaim in the same strain, refusing for many years to buy a house there, because all was going to destruction. And at last I had the pleasure of seeing him give 5 times as much for one as he might have bought it for when he first began his croaking. It's hilarious. Working for himself, Franklin's habits of industry were increased by self-interest. The first job of any size that came to the new firm was that of printing 40 sheets of the history of the Quakers, with Franklin setting the type and Meredith running the press. It was resolved to turn out a sheet a day. Alright, we're going to stop there. That's the end of part 3. And we'll see you again in part 4. Thanks for listening.